In the winter of 2019, a financial journalist named Claire Ballantyne was researching a piece on generational wealth concentration in America and found herself tracing a specific data point backward through time. She had been looking at the board composition of the 6 largest financial institutions in the United States: J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citigroup, Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs, and Morgan Stanley, and had noticed that the family names appearing in the ownership records, the advisory board listings, and the senior governance structures of those institutions were not random. They clustered, they recurred. The same surnames appeared in the institutional histories of those banks at the founding, at the critical mid-century consolidations, and in the current governance structures in proportions that were not consistent with the natural turnover one would expect in institutions that had been operating for a century or more. Ballantyne noted the pattern in her research files. Her published article, which appeared in Bloomberg in April of 2019, described American wealth concentration in general terms without drawing the specific genealogical connections she had mapped. Her editor, she later told a colleague, had flagged the genealogical framing as too speculative for the publication's standards. The research files are her own. The pattern she documented in them has not been published. They were the families that controlled American capital at that moment. The Rockefellers are through Aldrich, the Morgans through Davison, the Warburgs through Paul, the Stillmans and Bakers through Vanderlip and the National City Bank network, the Kuhn-Loeb interests through the Schiff-Warburg connection. 6 men in a room representing perhaps a dozen family networks, drafting the framework that would govern American monetary policy. 113 years later, the institutional descendants of those family networks are still at the center of American financial power. The names have changed in some cases, the institutions have merged and reorganized, but the genealogical and institutional continuity between the families in that Jekyll Island lodge in 1910 and the governance structures of the institutions that dominate American finance today is not a matter of inference. It is a matter of documented record, a record that no institution has been asked to formally trace and no government body has been required to examine. Before we go further, if investigations like this are what you come here for, hit subscribe so the next one finds you when it drops. The algorithm tends to suppress this kind of research unless you tell it otherwise. To understand what the continuity between 1910 and today actually looks like, and why it matters that it has never been formally examined, we have to trace each of the Jekyll Island families through the century that followed and establish what the documented record shows about where their institutional influence went. The Rockefeller family's trajectory from Jekyll Island to the present is the most extensively documented and the easiest to trace. Nelson Aldrich, the Senate Finance Committee chairman who organized the Jekyll Island meeting, was John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s father-in-law. The Standard Oil fortune that John D. Rockefeller Sr. had accumulated was, at the time of the Jekyll Island meeting, in the process of being disaggregated by the Supreme Court's 1911 antitrust decision. What the antitrust breakup of Standard Oil produced was not the dispersal of the Rockefeller fortune, but its multiplication. The component companies of Standard Oil, distributed to shareholders as separate entities, appreciated dramatically as independent companies and made the Rockefeller family substantially wealthier than it had been as a single monopoly. The Rockefeller family used that wealth to establish Chase National Bank, which merged in 1955 with the Bank of Manhattan to form Chase Manhattan, which merged in 1996 with Chemical Bank, which merged in 2000 with JP, Morgan & Company to form J.P. Morgan Chase, the largest bank in the United States. The current governance structure of J.P. Morgan Chase does not bear the Rockefeller name in any prominent position. The institutional lineage from Chase National Bank, established on Rockefeller capital, runs without interruption to the present. The family's various foundations and investment vehicles maintain stakes and board relationships across the financial sector that are documented in the Foundation's public filings and in the SEC disclosure records of the relevant institutions. The Morgan lineage is more direct and more visible. J.P. Morgan and Company, represented at Jekyll Island by Henry Davison, has maintained its institutional identity across a century of mergers, reorganizations. Morgan Stanley, which was spun off from JP Morgan in 1935 when the Glass-Steagall Act required the separation of commercial and investment banking, carries the Morgan name and the Morgan institutional tradition into the present as one of the largest investment banks in the world. The families connected to the Morgan banking network, the Davisons, the Lamonts, the Straits, have maintained positions in the financial and philanthropic institutions that the Morgan network generated through a pattern of board membership, foundation governance, and investment relationship that is documented in the public records of those institutions, and that has persisted across generations. The Warburg connection runs through Kuhn, Loeb and Company, which merged with Lehman Brothers in 1977 and was then absorbed into American Express in 1984 before its institutional identity was eventually dispersed through a series of subsequent transactions. The dissolution of the Kuhn-Loeb institutional identity does not mean the dissolution of the Warburg family's financial presence. The Hamburg-based M.M. Warburg and Company still operates as a private bank and is still majority owned by members of the Warburg family. Its current managing partners are documented in the bank's public disclosures. The family's American connections, maintained through foundation boards, university governance, and investment relationships, are documented in the public filings of the relevant institutions. The institutional form has changed. The family's presence at the center of European and transatlantic finance has not. The Stillman Rockefeller National City Bank lineage is the most directly traceable to a contemporary institution, National City Bank, which Frank Vanderlip ran at the time of the Jekyll Island meeting, and which was the largest bank in America in 1910, became First National City Bank, became Citicorp, became Citigroup, the third largest bank in the United States. James Stillman, who as National City Bank's chairman was the institutional force behind Vanderlip's position, had married his daughters into the Rockefeller family. The Stillman-Rockefeller family connection, documented in the genealogical records and in the inheritance documentation of the National City Bank, interests produced a set of family stakes and governance relationships in what became Citigroup that have persisted, in modified form, into the present. The pattern across all of these lineages is the same. The institutional form changes, banks merge, investment houses reorganize, corporate structures shift through regulatory and market pressures. The family networks that controlled those institutions in 1910 maintained their positions within the successor institutions through a combination of ownership stakes, board appointments, professional networks, and the institutional knowledge that comes from multi-generational participation in the governance of the same industries. The Forbes 400 list of wealthiest Americans in 2023 includes families whose fortune origins trace to the Gilded Age industrial and banking networks represented at Jekyll Island. The share of American wealth held by the top 1% of households, which stood at approximately 45% in 1913, the year the Federal Reserve Act was signed, declined through the mid-20th century under the pressure of progressive taxation and the New Deal regulatory framework, and has risen again since the 1980s to approximately 38% as of the most recent Federal Reserve distributional accounts. The families whose networks designed the Federal Reserve were in the top fraction of that top 1% in 1913. Their institutional descendants are in the same position today. The regulatory framework those families designed in 1910 and had enacted in 1913 has been modified many times in the intervening century. It has never been fundamentally restructured in ways that diminished the institutional advantages of the private banking networks that participated in its design. The modifications have consistently moved in the direction of expanding Federal Reserve authority and member bank discretion, the direction that benefits the institutions those families control, and have consistently been opposed by efforts to expand public oversight or democratic accountability over the central bank. The percentage of total American wealth held by the families in those networks has not declined dramatically from the share they controlled in 1910. In some cases it has increased. The mechanisms through which the Jekyll Island family networks have maintained their institutional positioning are not mysterious. They are documented in the public records of the relevant institutions. University governance is one of the primary mechanisms. The boards of trustees of Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Columbia, and the University of Chicago have included members of these family networks in proportions that have remained remarkably stable across a century, giving those networks influence over the educational institutions that produce the professional class that staffs the financial system. Foundation governance is a second mechanism. The major philanthropic foundations established by the Jekyll Island families control billions in annual grant-making that shapes academic research, public policy development, and journalism in ways documented in the Foundation's own public filings. The revolving door between the senior leadership of the major financial institutions and the regulatory agencies that govern them is a third mechanism documented in the employment histories of senior Federal Reserve, Treasury, and SEC officials across the past century, which show a consistent pattern of movement between the institutions those officials regulate and the regulatory bodies that govern them. A political scientist named Thomas Ferguson, whose 1995 book Golden Rule examined the relationship between investment banking families and American political outcomes, documented the persistence of the Jekyll Island family network's influence on American financial policy through a systematic analysis of campaign finance, regulatory appointment, and legislative history from 1896 to the mid-1990s. Ferguson's methodology, tracing the institutional and financial connections between major investment banking networks and the political decisions that shaped the regulatory environment in which they operated, produced specific, documented findings about how the families represented at Jekyll Island had used their financial presence in American politics to maintain the institutional framework the Federal Reserve Act had established. Ferguson's book was published by the University of Chicago Press, was reviewed in academic political science journals, and was not reviewed in any major financial press outlet. It has been cited by academic researchers studying campaign finance and political economy. It has not been cited in any congressional proceeding or regulatory review related to banking policy. A sociologist named G. William Domhoff, who spent decades studying the American power elite and published a sustained series of studies from the 1960s onward, documented the social networks, the club memberships, the university board seats, the foundation governance roles, the corporate directorship interlocks that connected the families of the American financial establishment across generations. Domhoff's methodology was criticized by mainstream political scientists as insufficiently quantitative, but his specific documented findings, the names, the institutional affiliations, the board memberships, the family connections, are drawn from public records and are verifiable by anyone with access to the relevant directories and filings. His most recent update to the central database, published in the 2010s, shows the same families in the same institutional roles at the center of the same networks 100 years after those networks were first organized. No regulatory body has ever been required to examine whether the concentration of financial governance in the institutional descendants of the Jekyll Island families has produced systematic conflicts of interest in the regulation and operation of the American financial system. No congressional investigation has examined the degree to which the families that drafted the Federal Reserve Act, through their representatives at Jekyll Island, have benefited from that Act's provisions over the century of its operation, or whether the Act's design was specifically advantageous to the families involved in its drafting. No published study has traced the complete genealogical and institutional connections between the 6 men at the Jekyll Island meeting and the current governance structures of the financial institutions that descend from the institutions they represented. A study that would require access to public records, SEC filings, foundation disclosures, and the published genealogical records of the relevant families, all of which are available. Why do the same family networks that controlled American finance in 1910 continue to occupy central positions in the governance of the institutions? that control American finance today, without any formal examination of whether that continuity reflects the natural outcome of meritocratic participation in competitive markets or the multi-generational perpetuation of institutional advantages created by the regulatory framework those families designed. Why has no institution with the standing to commission a systematic examination of the relationship between the Federal Reserve, Act's design, and the long-term financial outcomes of the families who drafted it ever been asked to conduct that examination? Why does the academic literature that documents the persistence of the Jekyll Island family networks, Ferguson's investment bank analysis, Domhoff's power elite studies, Chernow's banking histories, circulate in specialist academic publications without producing any formal policy or regulatory response from the institutions those studies describe? Why did Claire Ballantyne's editor flag the genealogical framing of documented public records as too speculative for publication in a financial journalism outlet? And what does it mean for the public's ability to understand its financial system that the documented connections between the families who designed that system in 1910 and the families who govern it today cannot be published as a factual account in mainstream financial journalism? The major financial journalism outlets, Bloomberg, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, are themselves owned or substantially funded by the same institutional network they would be required to examine to publish that account. Bloomberg LP is a private company. The Wall Street Journal is owned by News Corp, whose board includes representatives of the major investment banking networks. The Financial Times is owned by Nikkei, whose governance includes connections to the same transatlantic financial networks. The institutions that would need to be examined to publish the account are the institutions that fund the publications that would need to publish it. That is not a conspiracy. That is a structural conflict of interest built into the ownership of financial journalism, and it is documented in the public ownership records of the publications involved. These questions do not go away because the institutions involved are large, legitimate, and essential to the functioning of the American economy. The legitimacy of an institution's current operations does not resolve the question of whether its founding design was structured to perpetuate specific family advantages, whether that design has in fact perpetuated those advantages across the century of the institution's operation, and whether the public that the institution claims to serve has ever been given a full accounting of what the institution's design was for. The Federal Reserve is the most powerful financial institution in the world. It was designed in a private meeting by men representing 6 family networks. Those family networks are still at the center of American finance. That sequence, from the private meeting to the current governance structures, is a documented matter of public record. It has never been assembled into a complete account and placed before any body with the authority to act on it. The 2008 financial crisis is the most recent illustration of how the continuity operates in practice. When the financial system collapsed in September of 2008, the government officials who designed the rescue, Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson, Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke, New York Federal Reserve President Timothy Geithner, made decisions that protected the institutional interests of the largest financial institutions at the expense of smaller institutions, individual homeowners, and the general public. Paulson came directly from Goldman Sachs, where he had been chief executive. Geithner would subsequently join the private equity firm Warburg Pincus, named for the same Warburg family, after leaving government. The firms that benefited most from the 2008 rescue were the direct institutional descendants of the networks represented at Jekyll Island in 1910. The regulatory reforms enacted in the aftermath, the Dodd-Frank Act, have been progressively weakened since their enactment by lobbying from the same institutional networks. That is not inference. It is the documented legislative history of the past 15 years. The Jekyll Island Lodge still stands. The Jekyll Island Club has been restored as a hotel. You can book a room in the same building where the Federal Reserve was drafted. The guests do not know when they walk the grounds that the families who sent their representatives there in 1910 are still governing the institutions that draft was designed to create. Not as a conspiracy, not in secret. In the public records of SEC filings, foundation disclosures, board appointment announcements, and genealogical registries that are accessible to anyone who looks for them. The record is public. The examination has not been done. These records survive because people refuse to stop asking. If this matters to you, subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. History does not disappear when it is buried. It disappears when no one looks for it. Next week, I am pulling a thread that connects the multi-generational governance persistence of the Jekyll Island family networks to a specific provision of the Federal Reserve Act that has been amended 17 times since 1913, in every case in a direction that expanded the authority of member banks at the expense of public oversight. Each amendment was supported by lobbying from the same institutional networks. The legislative history of each amendment is public. The names of the lobbying organizations are public. The genealogical connections between the families who signed those lobbying papers and the families at Jekyll Island in 1910 are in the public record. They have never been published as a connected account.